Previously on the Angling Wisdom Podcast.
Somebody who I really respect in the industry. He's freshwater fishing Hall of Famer, Bill Siemantel. Welcome to the show, my friend. How are you?
I am doing great, Patrick. How about you, brother? You know, there's so much ego out there, and people are going to go, I don't believe him, or he's full of it, or whatever. But if they could just sit back and get outside of themselves, there is so much stuff to learn. I always want to go out there and do the best I can, no matter what. I always break down the top, middle, bottom. But you got to be quick enough in playing chess to get rid of all the BS, to come back down to the fundamentals of where are you standing, your LLLs, location of you, location of the bait fish, location of the fish themselves, and the location of how you bring the lure in through to make a funnel for them to attack.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I was talking about that on like my second episode, because we went to a place called Keyhole Reservoir. We were trying to catch walleyes, and everybody was like, man, the fishing's terrible. The weather's terrible. You can't catch fish right now. My son and my dad and I went out and we caught like 25, like just boom, like that. But what the deal was is all the walleye guys were in shallow and they were looking right up against the structure. All the walleyes were suspended. Every single one of them. I mean, they were out. And I mean, on the sonar, it's just like fish after fish, just all out there. And why are they out there? Their food is out there. It's like, well, yeah, guys, that's where they're at. So it's so critical to understand fish behavior, because if you don't understand fish behavior, you don't catch the fish. But you may have that one technique that you've used over the years that's done pretty well for you, and that's your go-to, and that's great. But if you're not flexible enough, like you're talking about, to have a plan and to deal with some adversity. I've had hard days, you've had hard days. That's how we get better. If you don't have hard days, you don't learn anything. Understanding that struggling is okay. Not catching fish is teaching you something. What am I missing here? And you have to really break that down. So I like how you did that, because that's kind of the same process that I go through a lot of times with walleyes, with trout. It's like, okay, well, this isn't working. Why is that? And I start to think through, okay, well, where are the bait fish? That's going to draw these predators no matter what, because they got to live. It's just like us. We got to go to the grocery store. I mean, that's just the way it goes.
Or McDonald's.
So they're going to go
box, yeah.
Yeah. And so it makes sense, but it's kind of fun to talk through it, because moon phase is an example. I used to swear by the full moon, used to swear by the no moon. Then I started realizing, I'm like looking back at my logs of like pictures of when I was catching these big walleyes, and I'm like, catching big walleyes at all the moon phases. I don't really know that it matters that much. It's really all those other things that are more important. But I wanted to talk about it because a lot of guys will do that. They'll say, well, it has to be this kind of barometric pressure, like you said, for 3 days, a steady barometer. You don't want anything up or down, which, I mean, it affects some of the behavior. But like you said, that top, middle, bottom, maybe it forces them up, maybe it forces them down, but you got to go find them. That's your deal if you're an angler.
I'm going to tell you I'll tell you the biggest thing. So if I was going to tell an angler for wisdom, what's the most important thing in fishing of all species? Learning topography. Bottom line. So, and I'm going to prove the theory, and I'll give you an examples. No matter what species you go after, and like tomorrow we're going to go out to the ocean and I'm going to go drag for halibut. I do not, everywhere I go, it doesn't matter what species, striper, halibut, bluefin, like open water trout, bluefin, nomadics are a little different. But when I'm looking at structure-oriented fish, from carp to crappie, bluegill, bass, you name it, structure, understanding topography. That is your starting point of everything. So what you're just saying, here's how we're going to twist and turn everything upside down. Most anglers are going to go, hey, Bill, what weather, what moon phase, what temperature? Everybody's looking above the water. All anglers look above the water because that's all they could see and feel and understand. Mm-hmm. Get rid of it all. Turn everything upside down. No matter what you do, what time of year, anything, start at the bottom. So if you could visually picture taking the water out of a lake, and I do this all the time. When I go out and drink a cup of coffee in the morning, I look at the mountains. I watch the deer on the hill. I look at shadows. I look at crevasses. I look at little spurs, fingers, points, humps, ridges, flats. That's life for a fish. So that is number one. So get rid of all the other stuff. Forget all the peripheral BS. I don't want to say all the bad words. I know we've got kids watching, but get rid of all the stupid stuff that we think are important and go right to the bottom of the lake. When you do that, you're going to start looking at, there's 5 like key elements: your points, ridges, humps, flats, and walls. Those are all elements within a water column. So it doesn't matter if you're fishing 2 foot of water or 200 foot of water, those elements will always stay the same. Now you look at it, for what I do is what element will produce the best ambush or feeding opportunity? What's the off ramps to McDonald's? What's the flat Cracker Barrel? You know, when they want, you know, what are the opportunities not only for the fish but the bait fish to hide and protect themselves? And how are they going to be ambushed and pushed into a J hook, an L? So these are the L's and J's you want to always remember when you're looking at structure. Because if you could picture a wall that comes down 30 foot in the water and it creates an L, that L is your funnel. That L is a wall coming this way into a bluff wall. That's your funnel at an angle. You know, L's and J hooks are areas that fish can push in, do directional changes with your bait to create that illusion of realism for fish. It's not just bass. I'm going to go bass fishing tomorrow for halibut. I'm going to drag a 2-ounce sinker with a big sardine, just like I would drag a 4-inch roboworm on 5-pound test line looking for spotted bass, largemouth, or smallie. And that's where I think everybody is lost. There's so much content out there, which there is, but I get rid of all the stuff that really doesn't matter to me, and I look at the stuff that matters to the fish. And structure is the number one. If you heard it anywhere first, you heard it right here. That is the key to being a great angler for every species that swims. Structure. And then go from there. Then go bottom, middle, top. Because somewhere within that perfect strike zone, the fish are going to be somewhere in there. And that's why maybe guys are like going, what's a great bait? Throw a Senko. It flutters through the top, middle, and bottom. If you pay attention, you might key into that suspended fish for that moment. Bada bing. 2 hours later, they might eat off the surface. And I guarantee you sometime during the day, they're going to eat off the bottom. But all fish suspend. Nothing just lays on the bottom. So that's the magic of that. So that should throw a monkey wrench into all this stuff that everybody's trying to throw out there. Get rid of everything. Learn structure. Look, read a topo map, go outside, look at the mountains, and go, if you're a hungry fish, how would you approach this to feed? Because you have no hands.
Right.
You got to be able to do it with just your mouth.
That's a good point.
Things will start changing in your mind. And then you can start playing even better chess.
Yeah, we were talking about that when we did the radcast, when you talked about how it's the same as elk hunting, right? Or any other kind of thing. I mean, really, it's all the underwater is just like looking at the mountains or anything that we can visually see. And I was thinking about that on this particular body of water that we have here. So it's got largemouth bass, it's got tiger muskie, bluegill, perch. It's just a big bowl, but it's not just a big bowl, right?
Mm.
Like there's reeds, you know, on the edges. There's this weird chara kind of stuff down at the bottom. There's a couple of like inlet outlet areas that have cuts in them. And so that's how I break it down, is looking for stuff like that. And it doesn't matter whether I'm a reservoir, a pond, or a lake. It doesn't.
You brought up one of my lower lakes. I've caught fish. Yeah, that's where I caught my largest largemouth. It's 19.8, just shy of 20 pounds. It's a bowl, okay? But you start with the bottom of the structure, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where, when you read the book that Jones and I put together, and this is why it was so emphatic. That's why Mike was like, when we went fishing, he just sat there and looked at me and just went, what? And it took me a while to be able to explain to him, because I know I'm probably, you know, some people call me an idiot savant, because most of the time I'm an idiot. And then I have moments of, I know I'm probably on the scale of autism somewhere within that thing too, because I just see things different. But within that, that's where I started adding the plus values and the point values. So if you have just a bowl, That's all it is. Well, that whole bowl is a 1. So now how do you add to it? You put a rock ridge right here. Something lays on top of it. That's a 2. You have a grass that creates, the grass comes out and creates the L. So you have the L above the grass before it hits the surface, and you have the wall of the L and then the bottom of the L. That's how many layers that I'm thinking. So that's a 3. You have a tules with grass. So you have tules that the fish can get into. You have the tules that go down into an L. There's grass out in front of it. So now you have not only an upward approach through the tules, you have an upward approach going outward into the grass. So there's multiple L's and angles. So as you go from there, you start adding on to the structure and cover elements. And as you do that, your inlet, you're just talking. See, I see everything visually with color. So you said you had a bowl and you had some outlets. We have 2 outlets with grass in it that create an L that come out and that have 2 other corners. So that's double L. So there's multiple strike zones depending on how the fish are positioned. Yep. Bottom, in the mid, and then the top over it. And then out in front of it, there's probably a blowout or a high spot from the sand coming out. So now you have a hump. So those are so when I start seeing that visually in my mind, then I put this on and I start looking through the fish's eyes and going, okay, now Papa wants to eat. Where's the best way to eat? And then it's so easy to go, oh, I don't need to make 500 casts here. I make 1 here, 1 there, 1 there. Let them talk to me. Clear water works better because visually you can see how they lift, how they approach your bait. If they don't want to come up to the surface, you get to read them quicker in water. But if you don't have that, get a Lowrance. That's where that forward-facing sonar is going to tell you, like, I'm getting follows, but if I stop it and the fish stop and go down, they don't want the bait stopped. So keep increasing the bait. I'm pulling them away from cover and structure. Turn around, bring it back into it, create that funnel. So there's so many more things that we have to our advantage now. But your eyes and your brains, I just really don't think a lot of people use it as much because you get lost in all the other stuff. You're getting me all jacked up, Patrick. Like
it's part of the fun, man. We're trying to pass on some of your wisdom here. And
people are gonna sit there and just go, "This guy's I don't understand him." Which is good because it helps me win more tournaments.
All I got to say is you don't end up in the Hall of Fame and winning all those tournaments by not knowing what you're talking about. So yeah, I'm enjoying learning.
You know, the whole thing, and I got to put that to bed too. It's cool to have an accolade, but I'm not one of those guys, you know, the catching all that. That's why I stopped. And here's where if there's any type of knowledge out there for especially the youth, don't get caught up for the size of the fish. For like, you need a 10-pounder for a trophy. Don't get caught up like, oh, that guy's great, I got to listen to him because he's a Hall of Famer. No, you got to start finding your own path and fishing, and don't set goals of other people's goals. Set your own goals, and it's going to be easier baby steps. That if your biggest fish is 2-pounder, you just want a 3-pounder, and then you get a 4-pounder, and those are trophies for you until you get up to a position to start, if you want to do that. But man, I watched an angler. I was back east, and he's like, I will never catch it. Like, I'm in Maine, I will never see a 10-pound fish. I'm never going to be a trophy hunter. And this is back in 2005. This is years ago, and that crushed. I'm like going, oh, and that's why I hate guys who say they're trophy hunters, and you have to have a 10-pounder to be in the rec. That's probably the most stupidest thing to say, because you can go out and catch a 4-pound spotted bass, and that's a trophy. You know, a 5-pound largemouth in probably 3/4 of the states in the U.S., 5-pounder is a trophy. Yep. So that's what I hope anybody that's listening that really wants to go to that next level is go to your next level, and then always question how you did it. Don't take anything for granted and tear apart everything that you've done. And even if you have to, you know, we got cell phones nowadays, you know, document, do a voicemail, do something, write down, say, I was here and this is what I saw. What does this mean? You know, and then within that, say, okay, and that was a keynote. Can I duplicate that? And if you could duplicate it, that's the stuff you put in your back pocket, because it might not happen again for 3 years. But I guarantee you, on the 4th year, you see something and you go, I remember that when I was a kid.
Oh
And you
yeah.
hear stories like that, and then they go back and they put a whooping on somebody. I did that when I was somebody at the Delta. Fishing was horrible. I think this just happened at one of our local tournaments. The fishing was horrible, and I went back to a place where I used to fish with my dad in an aluminum boat on the Delta, California Delta, and I just went fishing. I was like, that's the best piece of information I've heard in 15 years. And the guy did well. I think he was top 5 or something and made a paycheck. But I'm just sitting there going, that guy, that had the biggest nugget of information than all this other BS out there. Like, you have to use this lure. You're not going to do anything.
Well, and I think the industry, like, it doesn't matter if you're in the walleye side, the trout side, the bass side. The industry always has, you got to have this hot new lure. You got to have this thing, that thing. And I always go back to something you and I talked about a little while back. One of my favorite all time is just a marabou jig because it catches everything that swims. And when I'm having an off day and the fish are telling me, Patrick, I don't like your cranks, I don't like this, I don't like that, I'll throw on a marabou jig. And oftentimes that'll be the thing that there's just start whacking, and it's stuff that most people would never buy. It's the really inexpensive, great little lure, but it catches just about everything.
Everything.
It's wild.
Yeah. And here's where, we talked about the carp, and here's another thing to think about. If I was an angler and I wanted to like learn, so there's a big thing out there of tools, which is your lures, but within that tool, there's techniques, and understanding the techniques. There is no finesse of using a small bait because you could finesse a big bait, and you can finesse a big bait just like a small bait, but you could power fish a small bait like you could power fish a big bait. So that's where this disconnect is. And when you start looking at a crappie jig, like when I grew up, I used to buy them from Bass Pro Shop, a pack of 10 for 99 cents. Before that, Dad showed me how to make them out of a mustad hook, a lead weight marabou, and we hand tied them in with black heads, red throat, marabou, strip them. And I've caught fish. I know I've got probably 20 fish over 10 pounds, and my biggest is 18 on a crappie jig with 6-pound test line. But when you do that, you start learning things. When you fish crappie, you fish trout, you fish bass, and you fish catfish, because the technique within that crappie jig was the key that I learned when I was a kid. The sawtooth up, pendulum, crappie, bass, trout, quick snaps, catfish across the bottom, bluegill, slow roll. There's techniques within a tool that if you understand it, they go for multiple different species. And that's the key. You pop a crappie jig hard, you're going to scare every carp in a back bay pocket. You put a 32nd ounce black marabou little crappie jig on, and you fire it out there with 2-pound test, and you barely move that thing as slow as you can through the water column. It looks like a little midge. You might hook into 20 and 30-pound carp, just because the action dictates that certain technique that triggers that certain species of fish. And that's what the BBZ is all about. And that's what, angling wisdom is all about, is there are so many other layers that are so much more important than a lot of the stuff that people are talking about nowadays.
Yeah. It's funny. You talked about the marabou. That's probably my number one bait in the wintertime. I mean, especially for those big trout like behind me.
Oh.
Like, it's just insane how many big fish you can catch on a marabou jig.
Right.
And it's so much fun to fish too. I think you would agree with me on this. It's a fun bait to fish.
It is, and I don't even know if we could pull this one off, but I've made them my whole life. I designed some of the best doll hair jigs on the market for years. I've actually gone to a whole new level. So we're getting ready to go up to Plumber's Lodge as our team. And I did a lot of research last year. And I dumped 3 50-pound lake trout, 50-pounders. And I was using some of my old tiger tubes that I built with Pete Cormier back in the 90s. And these fish were so big, and we were hooking them at such deep water. It was bubble gum in massive teeth. So I didn't have enough reel force, even on a reel set, to get a good hook set in these monster lake trout at super deep water, even using braid and stuff. So I came home and I'm like, you know what? I have an idea. I know what I'm going to do. And let me see if I can show you this. So those are 15 to 13 inch doll hair jigs. I custom made them. And what I did is, this is what's going up to the Arctic Circle. Those are all 2.5 ounces. They're literally, they're this long.
Right.
And what it is remember, we're talking about finesse. It doesn't matter the size of the bait. It's the concept. Well, once I go to doll hair, now I don't have the friction to hold me back on a good hook set for a reel set. Plus, I still have the life of that bait becoming alive in the water with the marabou and doll hair. Yep. So now I'm throwing baits and I'm catching ocean fish with it, Patrick. I'm going to have one time. I'm catching big calicos on it. I'm hooking sea bass on them. Like, so that's the thing where people like, your favorite bait was this big. And then you're going to come to a day one day, you're going to go, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to have marabou jig this big, which is no different than a preacher jig. And you're going to catch monster walleye on it. It's all the same. But the angler's got to start looking through the fish's eyes and tweaking a couple things to get to that level. Yeah.
So I want to talk about another thing about bass, because it gets a lot of discussion. What difference does it make with the color? Talk to me about color and what bass can see, what they can't see. Does it matter? What are your thoughts on color?
I fish like 3 colors. I look at it this way. Size is one of the key things, and angles, especially when you're using big baits. I always look at my picture window, like what is the fish is going to see. If you're using a topwater bait, if you're bringing into structure, are the fish going to follow it? Are you bringing it into the fish? So those are all the little factors I'm looking at for that point. So even though this is like a 6-inch bait and it looks really beautiful because we see it like this, right? But if it's coming this way and a fish is either following it from behind, they're only seeing glimpse of a flash, or so you go down to 3 or 4 really basic colors, and even the watercolor really doesn't matter for a lot of it. You do a black, a watermelon, a white, and maybe even a smoke color, because smoke is a magical color. Smoke or a chrome, it's the simplistic color that absorbs the surrounding colors in the environment. So smoke pulls in the grass and the greens and the rocks and the browns. So it becomes really realistic. That's an illusion pattern, But when it comes down to it, I wouldn't overthink it. Get yourself like a white bone, a white color swim bait for bass, any type of watermelon, which will cover the bass and bluegill forage. And then your browns and blacks, which is your sculpin and your crawdads and your midges and your stoneflies. And I keep it simple because it still comes down to, and we're gonna go back this a couple times. None of that matters unless you're throwing it on the right spot. And if you don't understand structure and cover elements and know how to bring a bait into a funnel and make a fish think it's doing what it's doing to eat it, it's not gonna matter. You can throw the coolest bait out there. Now, in clear open water, spotted bass, trout, you got to look at, and you're the trout fisherman. I mean, you put me to shame, but when you look at overcast skies to clear skies, is it windy? Is there refraction on the surface? Trout are visual eaters until they get closer, and then they really get into that vibration. On clear water, on dirty water, they're all about vibration. They want that thumping, from a wigglewort to a Meps or a Phoebe. There's all these different sound vibrations that they'll key in on depending on what they're eating, the bait. But that is your flash. I mean, that's your Ford fenders. That's your flashers. You want to be able to draw a lot of attention to create a sphere of influence, even bass fishing, what we talk about, that pulls fish into it. And that's the only thing that I'll do is if I'm fishing around, say, heavy cover, grass or timber or something like that, I do like either a white or even a foil colored bait, because I want that spotlight, because the fish are going to be covered in something like this, right? and I want them to catch a glimpse and be able to go, what the heck was that? And create that picture window, and then have them come out, and then hopefully I'm bringing a bait into where they're going to eat. In open water, Patrick, I don't know about you on the trout side of it, but I do natural. Like if it's super sunny out, I'll do matte colors because I don't want as much flash. I want it more natural color where the fish are out there looking for their prey instead of being surprised by it. So but I still, if you looked at my box, everybody laughs. I have like 3 colors. And my favorite crazy color is still my morning dawn because it has a white belly and it has a chartreuse tail because I could visually see it in clear and dirty water at great distances. So I know I'm working the bait exactly the way I need to. So a lot of it's for me, to tell you the truth.
Talk to me about water clarity for a little bit, because that can be a big factor. Like
It is.
this body of water that I'm talking about, it used to be a clear body of water. It used to have largemouth bass, rainbow trout, yellow perch, and that was it. Now it has grass carp, which has made it very turbid. And so it's almost like a kind of a stained, really dirty kind of water. And it has changed the fishing. So talk to me a little bit about water clarity and kind of how that affects bass, especially.
The easiest way I looked at it when I was a fireman, and I remember taking out Gary Klein. He flew me down to Amistad before the Bassmasters, and we fished Lake Amistad. He put me in the boat and he says, "Go show me how to throw big baits." And we were passing information back and forth. And I showed him the fireman crawl. And there's a thing that I grew up in the fire department. It was a safety thing. If you're going into a burning building and it's vented and you could see, you could run in there and you know everything that's going on. You could do a lot of stuff really quick. And as visibility diminishes, the fear factor for predators, we're a predator just like a fish. That fear factor really it tightens up. So we do the fireman crawl. So what I do is, as visibility diminishes, what I do is I get closer and closer to the wall. When I can't see, I will never take my hand off the wall or I die. If you lose, if you get lost, you're the victim. I'm looking for a victim. So my hand will never leave the wall. And when I was a kid in the fire department, I started when I was 13, and I learned that. I always took that to fishing, and it's always helped me because the clearer the water, the greater the distance, you're able to work a bait because fish, and guys are seeing it now in open water, clear water. That's where that forward facing sonar, that's where the live target, that's where all this stuff is happening. They're finally seeing that because the fish are used to their environment. Trout are the same way. You always look at a predator in one element. You also have to look at their food. So our shad, individual shad, just going to be swimming out in dirty water. They're going to be more scared than anything. So they're going to be even closer to that cover structure elements. So everything plays within their own category. But as it gets darker and darker or harder to see, I fish closer and closer to cover and structure. When it's super dirty and muddy, man, I'll pitch and flip a bait into a bush 10 times. Because if it's dark, now you're working off vibration around that fish, and maybe you have to hit him in the nose where he triggers and he gets a good hit on it. You're using a Colorado blade on the bio, spinner baits that we're making. They have a higher thump density. They have more vibration and sound.
Right.
So when it comes by them, they're able to pick it up with their lateral line easier and strike it. So that's where it comes in with visibility. And here's the one thing that I do, and we talked about this on your old show too, and I know I've always had people, I do this to this day, is if I have consistent weather, I always play clear to dark. I always use clear water to dark water, which is shadows. And we talked about the plane of ecliptic and how the sun goes across the sky. Wintertime it's low, summer it's high, and you could use your body as a sundial. And you could, if you're 6 foot tall, no matter what the depth, from 20 feet down to 100 foot down, if I have a 6 foot L, I know exactly how far that shadow's coming in and out of that structure. And That's where it plays on super clear water when they're super deep. I use shadows, darker water, because that's the compression. It's like a tide. Compresses fish when the sun comes to a certain thing and then the sun goes the other way and it separates and the fish have to go find other areas. So shadows are very important in clear water. Huge. I've won more tournaments out of shadows that are this thick, shadows that are this thick. I'm not kidding. Like, and that deep. Okay. Hint, hint. Like, I see stuff that other people aren't seeing. To fish maybe a shadow this big in 25 foot of water that's down and 60 feet away from me. And then when the water gets darker, here's where it is. The faster it gets darker and muddy, the scareder the fish get and the tighter they get to structure and cover. And man, they're locked in. If you have a lake like yours that is consistently tannic now for say a year or two, your fish are going to get loose. You're going to be able to find them more offshore and more in open water because now their environment, they've gone from being completely sight oriented to now their sight is lateral lines. It's like a blind person they just feel more comfortable in their skin. That's how I adjust it. And I'll give you an example. Last year, we were fishing tournaments up at Pyramid. We just had major flooding. Lakes came up overnight, 20, 30, 40, 50 foot of water, brush, debris, phos check from the fires. It was a wreck. So we went from a clear body of water that went from 15-foot visibility on the average to zero. We fished tournaments, and here's a hint. The bite was so tough that some of the anglers we're fishing with are top notch. They could be in any elite series there is. They are fishing and never coming in with one keeper during the tournament for 2 to 3 tournaments in a row. Not one hit. And what happens is my buddy looked at me and Tim, and he's like, what are we going to do? And I, it's not a jab or anything. I said, I'm going to become blind. These are some of the words that because not only do I have to say it and do it in my head, is I'm fishing with a partner, or we're right now teaching. This is what this is about with Angling Wisdom, is I got to be able to visually say it outside, have somebody absorb it. Hopefully somebody's watching this and going, taking notes like, holy crap, no one's going to be getting this kind of stuff. Then I go out there, and then what do I say is the most important thing about everything? Structure. I got rid of all the debris and all the dirty water. I visually took it out of the equation. Boop. And then I went, okay, it's wintertime. Where the fish should be. Found those places. These fish were so tight against a rock in 20 foot of water or a stick that even with forward-facing sonar, you never saw them. Or they're in a piece of there's a little clump of grass like this big. There's a 3-pounder sitting in it. You can't see them. They're not moving. And I literally, my partner's sitting there, and I told Tim, and he will confirm this, and it was bad. I would throw out a Senko, a drop shot, a jig. I would throw out, close my eyes, and I would literally fish with braille. And I'm bringing it up, I look at the graph, and all of a sudden I feel the tick, or I feel the mushy, like, okay, there's my grass. And I sit there and I say this out loud so Tim would understand. I'm like, okay, I'm there. And I sit there, and sometimes I'm there, Patrick. I'm not kidding, for 5 minutes. I'm like, you're there. You're either sleeping, you don't know it's there. I'm just gonna keep knocking on your head. You're there. Come on, hit it. And he's thrown 4 or 5 times, and I'm not moving the bait. I'm sitting there. I'm like, I know you're there. You're gonna hit it. And I go, oh. And he looks at me. I go, get the net. I go, he's gonna hit it. I get a hit, catch a 3.5 pounder. We'd come in with a limit. One of the only teams that came in the limit. We won both Angler of the Years last year for doing this. We were catching 5 fish when other guys couldn't even get 1 hit. That's the depth. When it gets that tough, you got to really understand it's not what we're thinking. It's what the fish are thinking and doing and reacting. And that takes you to that whole nother level. And like I said, what you're bringing on this show right now with what we're doing right now, no one talks about this. You're not going to find a show out there that's going to have as much juice as what we're talking about right now. I guarantee you, I've never heard it. Like, I don't listen to shows because I'm like, it's a moon phase. You got to fish 58 degree water. and you got to use a wiggly worm.
Yeah.
It's something completely different.
Thanks for listening to the Angling Wisdom Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please go to patreon.com/anglingwisdom to sign up for bonus content or just to show your support for the show. You can also subscribe wherever you are listening to or watching this podcast. You can follow us on the socials by searching for Angling Wisdom on Instagram or Facebook. Thanks again to PK Lures for sponsoring this show. You can go to pklure.com and use the code WISDOM to receive 20% off of your next order. And of course, you can always go to anglingwisdom.com for more fishing content. This is Patrick Edwards signing off. I hope to see you out on the water.